So, Scott Gorringe, Director of Murray Matters Consulting, long history with Education Queensland, the University of Queensland, and originally from the Windora area is this speaker here. And Leonie Nunn, as you heard before, a long history with Education Queensland. A lot of people have had a long history with Education Queensland, which is not necessarily a very good thing because they're one of the more dysfunctional government agencies you might find. Because I've worked for them too. So that explains the three of us. So, and look, Leonie, of course, is a landholder in the Thompson catchment. As she described before, she's a passionate, I would say she's a passionate landowner. She's also become involved, obviously, in Desert Channels Queensland, and so has taken the step into the interesting world of river and Lake Eyre Basin politics to some degree. So has Janet Brooke, who is from further down on Cordillo Downs, as it turns out, in South Australia. And she has also done similar things and sits on the board of SAL, which is more or less the equivalent of Desert Channels down there.
But no Education Queensland.
But no Education Queensland, so that's why she possibly doesn't look quite as jaded as some of the rest of us. And of course, a man who needs no introduction whatsoever, because whenever there's a story about rivers, you see him on the ABC News with a river behind him, and a little beard, birds fluttering about, and Professor Richard Kingsford, who is basically in charge of the Australian wetlands and the Australian wetlands, rivers. I have to write it down because I can never remember it. Australian Wetlands, Rivers and Landscapes Centre at the University of New South Wales.
As Mike Chuck used to say, he said to me not long ago, he said, Richard, we'll know when you're dead. We'll know there's not a drought on and some rivers drying out, or there's not a flood on.
Yeah, nothing's happening with the rivers. Yeah, right. And I mean, a lot of people around the country actually don't like Richard. I mean, I find that terribly hard to believe. He's a very affable chap as far as I'm concerned, but, you know, there are people who don't like him. So what we're going to do to kick it off, each one of the panel members is going to give you a 1-minute summary of what the Lake Eyre Basin rivers mean to them and why they're important, and then we're going to head straight into it. So over to you, Scott.
Scott Orange. The Lake Eyre rivers, Cooper in particular, means kind of everything to me. It's where I grew up. It's the water I first drank. I learnt to swim. That was my swimming pool down there near the bridge at Windora. Had my own beach there, everything. Some council engineer in their wisdom ended up putting a big pushed a heap of dirt down and nearly washed the beach away, which annoyed us a little bit. But it means everything to me, the river. It's where all my family grew up. It's where all our stories are connected. And, yeah, it's kind of me in a whole heap of ways.
I think that's a pretty good summary. Leonie, it's your turn.
Well, Leonie Nunn, not like Scott. I didn't learn to swim because there's no water in Maree. But the whole system is integral to our way of life. I'm just passionate about it because it really is a wonderful part of the world. I hate using the word iconic, but it is iconic. And it's the lifestyle. It's the only lifestyle I've known, except for my years in Adelaide and university, etc., etc. Living in the Lake Eyre Basin has been the majority of my very short life. So, yes, I'm passionate about it.
Janet,
Unlike Scott and Leonie, I didn't grow up in the Lake Eyre Basin. I grew up very differently down on the coast and in another country. But I moved there, and we've made a choice to, with my husband, we've made our choice to make our lives and bring up our family in the Lake Eyre Basin. Why? I don't think you can sort of talk about the rivers specifically. I definitely can't do that because we live at Cordillo, and a bit the same as Sunnyside, we don't have the river systems on our property. But we derive our income from the Lake Eyre Basin. I like it because it provides a challenge. I don't think that you can live out. Oh, you'll never learn everything about it, so you're always learning. The challenges sometimes I don't particularly like. It's sometimes hard to live out here. Dust storms and the distance to keep up with friends and family. But it does provide lots of opportunity, and I hope it's given me lots of opportunity, and I hope that it gives my my kids the same opportunities.
Thank you, Janet and Richard.
Well, I guess I came out here in 1986, so I'm relatively new. But every year I have flown over parts of the Lake Eyre Basin. I have engaged in the various governance, community groups, and quite simply, I guess I love the environment. I think it's an incredible place. It's a very natural place compared to a lot of the other places I work in the Murray-Darling. And just as importantly as the rest of the panel, I love the people. I think they're just fantastic.
Thank you very much, Richard. And now we'll go to questions. And just bear in mind that Alan's going to be doing his own roadieing, so just give him time to reach you with the microphone. And our first question comes from Rupert Quinlan.
Rupert Quinlan in the blue shirt. Thanks, Adam. Dear panel, we seem to have a state government that for the time being is not listening, possibly even to their own local MP. What is it that we can do, or should do, or need to do to make them listen?
We'll go to Scott first on that one.
Oh, thanks, mate.
All right. Thank me later, buddy.
Oh God, I don't know. I think things like this certainly raise the profile of some of the challenges that that we face in trying to convince powers that be to protect this country. I think, you know, from my point of view, one of the groups of people that's kind of untapped at the moment is our Aboriginal mob all up and down the river, up and down the three rivers. I think there's huge potential in gathering a whole heap of momentum with them fellas to continue supporting things like this. Yeah, that's probably the only other answers I got, Rupert, but I'm sure there's somewhere in the heap in here.
Go to Leonie on that one.
I'm going to support what Scott said, but two things I think. We have to highlight what happened in Windora when Bob had his Cooper Creek Protection Group meeting. I thought they'd get 5-10 people at the most. 39 people, 11 apologies. Amazing for a town and a district the size of Windora. There's a landholder I know who would not normally go to anything like that. It really shocked me when I heard he went. So that speaks for itself. That's the type of press that you need to get out there, because you look at the size of Windora, and to get that many people, I congratulate you, Bob, and your committee. People are obviously passionate about it. And the other thing, we need some big players out there to push our message and what we're trying to do. And I want to look at you, David, like people with a bit of clout in the cattle industry. You're a well-known person in government circles and in local government circles. Like, we need that type of person to be out there pushing this story.
Thanks, Janet or Richard?
Yeah.
Janet?
I don't know. I've got a bit of an opinion. I think I don't disagree with either what Scott or Leonie have said. I do think that forums like this and the one that Bob organised in Windora give you some ideas, and they pick up the sentiments of the community, but you need to do a little bit more with that then. And you approach the state government with some real solutions. And I think there are some ideas, especially from today and yesterday, that are the start of those ideas of solutions that you can take to the government. I don't profess to be an expert on politics, so I don't know how to get around all that stuff, but generally, if you go with a problem to ministers, you don't get anywhere. But if you go with some solutions, you have a chance. So that'd be mine.
Steve Kingston.
So perhaps not everybody knows, but I'm a member of the Western Rivers Advisory Panel, which is the committee set up by the Queensland Government to come up with some recommendations of how to move forward on this issue. So I guess I'm keen to play that role and to bring my scientific knowledge to that, as well as my understanding of what these sort of decisions mean for the long term in rivers like this. I guess part of my motivation for being involved in trying to bring this conference together was the issue for me, which is very important, is that I don't think this is a local decision. A few people have responded in the media that this is a local decision and should be left to people here in the community. I actually believe this is a national decision. I actually believe that people in Australia care very deeply about the Lake Eyre Basin and its future. And so I think a conference like this can help to alert the wider community about the sort of issues that we're discussing today. I also agree with Janet. I think it is part of our challenge is to say, well, what's a better system? What would you come up with? And I think the real difficulty here is that politics has intervened, and that we might have had a good range of potential protection mechanisms under wild rivers, but the whole notion of wild rivers has is on the nose for the current government. So I think what I would like to see anyway is that we still have protection of flows and we have protection of floodplains, so that the rivers and their integrity is guaranteed for the future.
Thank you, panel, and we'll go to the question from the Right Honourable Terry Corn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Terry Corn from the Australian Floodplain Association. For the last 1.5 days, we've talked about the Lake Eyre Basin and what it means to people and how important it is. But I'd like to ask the panel, do you see yourselves as, and this community group here, as leaders or followers in this area? In other words, are there similar situations in other countries in the world where this sort of situation has arisen and we can learn lessons from them? Or are we leading the world in this sort of approach to a large-scale protection system?
I think we might throw it to Richard Kingsford.
So Richard Kingsford, look, I think we could be leading the world if we actually decide, and I'm talking about the Queensland government, the South Australian government, and the Australian government, Northern Territory government, the governments of the Lake Eyre Basin, leaving aside New South Wales, it's a bit incalcitrant on this issue. But we have actually been leading the world. There are not many other countries that are actually thinking through the lens of ecological sustainable development on rivers. Most of the other countries of the world are developing their rivers. And certainly in the scientific community, people are looking for Australia for its leadership. And I guess one of the things I worry about is the present direction that we might be going in terms of developing this river for water resources, is that we will no longer occupy that position. We will be seen to be pushed and pushed down the path that every other country, river, some with international borders. I mean, you know, one of my great, my exasperation is that if we can't get this right between states, how the hell is sort of Angola and Namibia and Botswana going to get it right for the Okavango? And we really do need to show some leadership here and say we are managing this whole river system on a catchment basis.
Janet Brooke, do you have a little comment on that question? Or you might because of your cross-border.
I think Richard's pretty much covered the cross-border thing. I do, from sitting in a position on the South Australian Arid Lands Board and also on the LEB CAC, I'm not too sure that the cross-border stuff, for want of a better word, is working as well as what it should be. I think there's a hell of a lot of room for improvement there between states. Again, I don't have the solutions for that just now, but I think it could be improved. I don't know what's going on in other places around the world, so I can't draw on those sorts of experiences. But sometimes I sort of think too, like, you don't have to always look outside. You can see the right way. Why not just do it? Just because every other river in Australia is being developed, or looking to sort of do extensive irrigation or other types of development on that, doesn't mean you have to do it here either.
Yeah, we've got about 4 questions lined up, so I'll just run through them. So, you want to have a quick shot at the time? Quick shot at it?
Scott, me personally, I think I'm both a follower and a leader in this, and I'd like to think that as a group, I think we're followers as leaders and as well as leaders in it. Sometimes I think we're tinkering around at the edges. Sometimes I don't think we're getting bloody hard enough with this thing, and especially with this cross-border stuff. And I think sometimes we're mucking around at this level when we should be doing a whole lot of work at this level, if you know what I mean. And in saying that, what I mean by it is, us as Aboriginal groups, I'm pretty sure we could come up with an agreement really quickly around how we're going to manage this river system. And with the expertise in this room, it'd be really nice to be able to try and do that together. The challenge is not what you're going to do, it's how we're going to be together as a group of people. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we face, is how we're going to be here, and do I trust you enough to be able to do the stuff that I require from these rivers, and do you trust me enough?
We'll move on to Angus's question.
A question, Angus Emmett, a question to Richard. Richard just made the comment, or informed the group a minute ago, that he was on the Western Rivers Advisory Panel, which is advising on this new direction from the Queensland Government. I'm also on that. We had a meeting last Monday and Tuesday, and it rained quite a bit. And I very successfully clocked up 7,500 kilometres and never actually got to the meeting. So, so a question from me, Richard. People would have seen in the Leader, and it's probably advertised elsewhere, but there's some amendments being put through on the Wild Rivers Code, and I was just wondering, it's to do with, we discussed it earlier today briefly, but it's to do with how mining and petroleum operates in the floodplain. Can you, seeing as you were there and I wasn't there, can you explain to me and the group what actually that means?
Yeah, and it has come up a few times, and we did have a discussion about it at the Western Rivers Advisory Panel. And I guess I probably see, I mean, Trevor's on the Western Rivers Advisory Panel, and I certainly remember the discussion, but it might be better if I perhaps throw to Trevor, and are you willing to sort of comment on that, Trevor? Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah, oil and gas, and to some extent the mining. I am on the Western Rivers Advisory Panel, as somebody said, and I think I'm about the only other person that hasn't been. I've been on nearly as many committees as Angus, so, and I've been involved in this process for a while, and I've been around the basin for 38, 40 years. Back to the amendments. The amendments were flagged very soon after the legislation came in, and in the rush there was, soon after that, identified 6 or 8 anomalies, which I'll go through in a little bit of detail in a moment. And they were flagged to government officers at the time. I'm not sure that the government in power at the time, the officers had time before they then, the government ministers had time before they then moved into election mode to pick that up, but certainly it was flagged straight away. Two of the items in there are administrative matters, and it relates strictly to petroleum, doesn't relate to mining in this context. There's two matters in there where in one place it says certain limited petroleum activity is allowed, and in another place it's anomalous about whether it is allowed or not. So it's about drafting of the document. So two of the items are around that. The rest of the changes relate to, in fact, in most cases, either items that create a safety issue or actually require increased disturbance on the floodplain and in the channel country compared to complying with current environmental authorities. As an example, a small wellhead compressor was intended to be allowed to be on an existing lease. The consequences of saying no to that is that that compressor will have to be at the nearest point off the floodplain, so it will require the building of a pipeline off the floodplain and then potentially another pipeline to take it back over to a processing facility. The lease restrictions that are in the current Wild Rivers were, there is talk of about a 3 hectare. The problem is with a 3 hectare you can fit 2 wells on it, but if you could get to 4.5 you could get 6. So to drill 6 wells at 3 hectares each, you've got to disturb 9 hectares of, you've got to create 9 hectares of pad. So it's around those areas. Limited petroleum activity, as it's always for the last 40 years, and I must mention that petroleum activity in about 250 wells already exist in the floodplain country south of Windora, and they still were in a condition that allowed the Wild Rivers legislation as it was originally brought in to come into place with that activity in there. But the limited petroleum activity allows you to have a temporary camp while you're drilling the well. The trouble is a restriction of 20 doesn't allow you to have enough people in the camp to run the rig. So you then have to build another camp at the closest point off the floodplain and have a road that is good enough to allow people to do their commuting on a regular basis. So again, that's about a safety and minimising disturbance. And there's a couple of other related to that in that it allows, the temporary camp allowed you to put, or the temporary rig allowed you to put a certain volume of diesel in there so that you could run the unit. The way the legislation's written, you've got to send a truck out there every day, a small truck out there carting diesel every day rather than putting more diesel. So the issues were ones that were flagged right at the start, and there is really no change to those in that process. They were well aware at the start. The petroleum industry took the approach that regardless of where the retraction of the Wild Rivers legislation goes, that it was tidier to get that existing Wild Rivers anomalies tidied up, and the other process will take its due course. So that's the explanation of those issues, and it is about, some about safety, some fixing some formatting anomalies, and in some cases reducing the safety risk for the employees.
Happy with that, Angus? Yeah, thanks, Trevor. Okay, we'll go to the next in the line, which is Barry Trail.
Barry Trail. Barry Trail, Pure Environment Group. South Australians, what do they think for the ex-South Australian and the current South Australian? I never know what they think. Does Adelaide, two sort of questions, does Adelaide think about the Lake Eyre Basin, or they just worry about the Murray for obvious reasons? And in the northeast, does the pastoral zone muse a lot that the water might stop coming?
We don't have Christopher Plano.
Do I have to say my name? Leonie Nunn. Oh no. So the question, what do South Australians think? Had an interesting conversation with a lady who lives on the Bursell track on the weekend regarding all this, and she was under the impression that the water resource plan and the Lake Eyre Basin agreement would cover them for anything that happened. And I was trying to explain to her, and I couldn't remember the word, that it's subordinate legislation, that the water resource plan is reviewed every 10 years. So they think that, well, her thinking was that everything's going to be hunky-dory, that it's covered. The other point that she made to be, they've had cattle drives down the Bursell track and other tourism initiatives, and the one that brings the most money in as far as tourism goes in is when Lake Eyre gets water in it. So they realise that this is the people in the area, though, realise the value. What people in Adelaide think, I don't know. But I just thought it was very interesting that they are under the impression that it's quite safe from the Queensland legislation, when in reality I don't think it is.
Janet, do you know anything about what people in Adelaide or other parts of South Australia?
Our region doesn't have a lot to do with Adelaide, but from what I know is that they are more focused on the Murray for obvious reasons. Leonie's point of, I think there is a lot of reliance put on whatever protection comes out of Queensland, because for lots of industries, and that includes the petroleum industry, they need the water when it flows to come through. And that would, the tourism industry over the last 3 years, it's a pity we haven't had Trevor Wright here. Is he still?
He's going to work out how to do Skype tomorrow.
Right.
Or overnight. So hopefully, yes.
Because it would be very interesting to hear from him. Like the tourism industry has had a huge boom thanks to even just partial water in Lake Eyre. So it's extremely important. But no, as in Adelaide, not particularly focused on the Cooper or the Warburton, as it's called when it comes out of Goyder's Lagoon. The focus for those, it's Lake Eyre. It's not necessarily how it gets there or what happens before. I don't know that there'd be a lot of knowledge of that at all.
People actually know the water comes from Queensland in Adelaide? No, I'm serious. There's Lake Eyre, water comes, it fills up. Most people don't actually think where it comes from. I'll just put that as a proposition.
I would say that before all the documentaries that Paul Lockyer had done on the Lake Eyre Basin and its flooding over the last couple of years, before that, maybe a lot of people didn't know where it comes from, but thanks to him, I would say that the knowledge of that would be a lot greater. But the appreciation of it, how far it comes and how far north it is and the distance that it travels, I'm not too sure whether there's that appreciation amongst common people, but I'm generalising.
I just want to add something to that. In 2011, I had the privilege to go on the boat ride along the Cooper where it crosses, where the punt is, and most amazing experience. And the man who was running this little MV, whatever he called it, he was quite knowledgeable, and there was a lady on this boat that said, "Oh, look at all this water, why aren't we doing something with it?" And I was about to say something, but he intervened and explained it. But yeah, the knowledge isn't there. I think a lot of people don't really know.
Okay, we've got two more lined up, and so we'll go to Peter Hughes.
Yeah, Peter Hughes, Georgina Pastoral. I think we're getting ourselves into a sweat worrying about what the new Queensland government's doing. I think the new government is anything that was done in the past, and I would concur with them. Anything that's been done in the last 20 years, it have to be looked at very closely because a lot of it's very suspect. And I think this is just everything's thrown up, and there's nothing like something like this to sharpen the focus and bring out the leadership skills in fellas like Scott. And anyway, I do think it's a worthwhile exercise in rehashing all this. It probably draws more attention to the Lake Eyre Basin. I think everyone in this room, it's the centre of attention at the moment. Probably the rest of Australia, it's not. But the wave will keep on going out. And the more people that are informed, probably the better decision that will be made. And I wouldn't be too hasty in rushing in and condemning the practice that we've been forced here to do this. And I'd be interested to hear what the panel's got to say. Thank you.
I was just thinking about the Lake Eyre Basin conference that we had in Alice Springs a couple of years ago, and there was a lot of talk about how do we get resources to help continue the research and improve practices, or how do we attract money to the region to continue on the work of the Lake Eyre Basin, CAC and SAP and SOP and all those things, and they needed a crisis. You know, so maybe something good out of this can come along. As what you said, it's sort of lifted the, you know, the spotlight has been put on the basin, and it can be turned into a positive rather than a negative, perhaps.
Well, I don't have a lot more to add to what Janet's just said. I do think this issue, and particularly the importance of this conference for getting this issue beyond the RAP and the inner circle that's been part of the decision making, is very important. Because I think just like South Australians probably think it's all hunky-dory, we've got the Lake Eyre Basin Agreement, and there's a little bit of tinkering around what we might be doing in the catchment. I think hopefully the attention that this conference gets will spark a wider debate, particularly in the national context, because as I said before, I don't think this is a local or a Queensland decision. It's actually, and not even a Queensland South Australian decision, it is actually a much broader decision than that. And we need as many people to be at least participatory in that decision making. And part of that is for them to know it's on, and that's an important part.
Scott, I agree with you, Pete. Yeah, I think something like this, you know, I think we've already seen the impact of just this forum here, right across the media, in the eastern states anyway, and down in South Australia. So it's certainly brought it back to people's attention, and it sharpened us up a little bit, I hope, and got me a little bit more fired up around things. Yeah, and I keep going back to what Barry said there around, do people know these rivers fill Lake Eyre? I think it's a good question, because when I go around the country doing the work I do, and I say I'm from the Cooper and Diamantina, they say, well, where's that? I say Lake Eyre. Oh yeah, I know where Lake Eyre is. So here's another question for us to be thinking about, I suppose. Do we shift the focus from the three rivers to Lake Eyre and say, do you want to see Lake Eyre disappear? I don't know.
I just have a concern with the fact that this government has the makeup of the RAP. There's not a conservation rep on it. No, but I mean, as in, I just think the makeup of the RAP was a bit political. Well, political. I don't think it was. It was not like the makeup of the previous Wild Rivers panel, and I think for us, the shift from with the RAPID board out here, the Remote Area Planning Development Board, they seem to have had a bit of a, and they're made up of so many local government mayors from out here, and they've seemed to have a rather a shift to encouraging irrigation or being in favour of irrigation, and particularly one Shire out here has sort of come out quite strongly in favour. And I think that is a concern, because they'll be taking those messages back to the government that this is what we want to do.
For those of you who don't know, the Lake Eyre Basin has got a RAP, a CAC, a TAC, it's got a LEMP, it's got a LEPA, it's got more acronyms than you could poke a stick at, and for most people, you probably just don't need to know about that. Bob Morris has the floor.
Oh, well, I was going to say Martin has been waiting longer than me, but I just want to reinforce.
He's got a funny shirt on.
I take that point. Because Leonie just touched on something I wanted to say before, but except I will do it in a much less diplomatic fashion than Leonie did. I too am very concerned about the change in composition of the RAP. Not only that, let me just take you back 16, 17 years, when the original Coopers Creek Advisory Party, as it was called, the CCAP, there are at least 4 or 5 South Australian people on it. And so many South Australian people, in fact, that Trevor Wright used to fly one of his planes, or I might have only had one then, I'm not sure, and fly them up to Longreach where most of these meetings were. And they included at least, I think, a couple from the South Australian government. There was the Murray Soils Board, if that still exists. And there was the representative from the Australian Conservation Foundation, South Australia. There was all, in terms of the conservation issue, there were 2 conservation reps on that, but also Queensland Conservation Council. So, you know, I thought there was a good representation, and South Australia certainly had the interest. South Australia then was completely interested in what might happen to inflows into their state and down the system. The Queensland government then at least recognised the need for that sort of participatory democracy. Now, with the removal of the one conservation rep who also happened to represent the Coopers Creek Protection Group, as well as the Australian Floodplain Association, that's Rupert, I feel that this government feels so bloody entrenched in its position that it not only cares about, that it doesn't even care about justice being seen to be done, let alone justice being done. I think these are arrogant and bloody offensive actions by the Queensland government, and they should be roundly bloody well condemned.
I think you should say what you really think.
Sorry, I've been a bit light.
We'll take that as a comment for sure. The Honourable Member for Hawaiian Shirts and Fine Coffee, Martin Denny.
Aren't you going to get a response from?
I think we'll take it as a comment. I think it was backing up what Janet and Richard had said. If that's all right with you.
Yeah, no, I do. Yeah, no. Martin Denny, the Hawaiian Shirt. Before I came here, there was, up to this meeting, and I'd say I was here at 96 and all the way through, but I had people had already said to me, and they felt a certain criticism of this whole meeting, and that it really was a whole lot of people who were coming here with all like interests. In other words, we were actually preaching to the converted. And one of the things that worried me was that there was no alternative view given at this thing, either from the irrigators or from the mines. Luckily, I hear that there is Trevor from Santos, I gather. It would be very nice if someone like Trevor or someone like that could actually defend or come up with some case for the elephant in the room.
Can I just comment on that before I perhaps get Trevor to comment? I guess from an organising committee point of view, we did invite all the politicians. We invited all of the government bodies. We invited all of that sort of layer, and certainly when I was meeting last week on the Western Rivers Advisory Panel, where there was some criticism, people said that they had got the invitations from 3 different places. So I think to argue that people didn't get a chance to get here or participate is not entirely true. I think there were opportunities. But I do think there's an opportunity, I guess. We've heard quite a lot about mining, and I guess Trevor, I've known Trevor for a very long time because we've been on various committees, and he's been a very active member of the Cooper Creek Catchment Committee and the Lake Eyre Basin Community Advisory Committee. And I guess that sort of is part of that history of oil and gas development in the basin. And Trevor, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. Trevor Whitelaw again. I obviously was on the Wild Rivers panel as well, and represented the petroleum and the resource sector on that at that time, as I am on the RAP for the same thing. At that time, that industry, along with at least a number of other industries and some other representatives there, took the view that the Labor government at the time was going to bring the Wild Rivers legislation in, so therefore there was no point in spending exhaustive energy fighting against having it in, so the answer was work to try and come up with legislation that's workable. And other than the anomalies I raised, we felt that got there. At some point, The current government sent an invite to a number of us, and certainly we didn't have any discussion on who was going to be on it at that time. I just got a letter out of the blue. By then I'd retired, so I had to ask other people if they were happy with me to stay on it or they wanted to give someone else. And in doing that, it was, well, the Minister Cripps is coming out here to Longreach as part of the first meeting. We didn't know what, I certainly didn't know. If others did, good luck to them, but I certainly didn't know what the direction was going to be. In fact, our industry at the time thought at the best it would be a tidy up in a couple of areas on the existing Wild Rivers Act, and that would be it. Obviously, the announcements made that day were a lot different, and that's where we are now. From a mining and a petroleum resources point of view, at the end of the day, I've already talked about 40 years of oil and gas production in the lower end of the Cooper. The mining and resource sector takes the view that there needs to be appropriate legislation. We don't necessarily agree that Wild Rivers is that legislation, but are not unhappy with existing other legislation being tightened up. There's already multiple layers of legislation, probably more for our industry than any other industry, and we don't have any trouble with some of them being tightened up. Queensland Resources and AP and Resources in particular have been out quite publicly, and they've written to the Minister saying that they are totally supportive of ecologically sustainable and keeping the rivers flowing and all that sort of stuff. What they don't want is prohibition, which doesn't allow you to then go in and see if something's there, and then a project gets up on its merits, both economically and all those other issues, and particularly in some cases, if technologies change, then there's the opportunity that you may be able to develop that project. If it doesn't get up, then so be it, if it doesn't meet that requirement. But there's a clear stated objective from the sectors I represent that's about keeping the river flowing, clean, doing the things that it's currently doing. Because I do have a strong interest in the Cooper. I am from South Australia, and I've been in this process not because I'm driven there by industry, I'm there because I do have that commitment, as much as at least the four out the front, and some others here that I know. So that's where the industry's at. If the Wild Rivers had stayed in, then so be it. But we would, given the current government has said it's not going to be, then the answer is other legislation needs to ensure that the key objectives are met.
Anybody else in the panel wish to talk about the presence absence of irrigators and or miners?
Richard, we invited the Galilee Basin Operators Forum as well, and Simon has been here.
Yes, I mean, I guess there was a general invite sent around, and I think many of, and Simon was?
Simon Garner, I can't see.
Maybe not here. So we did try and cover all the bases. I guess in terms of the irrigation industry, I'm not sure there's a peak body in the Lake Eyre Basin, so there wasn't easily identifiable people, but we know there are reps on the various committees, so there were opportunities, I guess, for people to come. So I probably don't want to add any more than that.
I've got three more questions lined up. The first one is from Bruce Haywell. Oh, you got a quick comment on that one, sorry, Gavin, if it's very important. If it's not, we'll eject.
Follows on. Yeah, it's Gavin here. I actually think it's really important, and I really say fundamentally important for community to have their say separate of government, separate of industry, separate of vested interests. I think that's actually fundamentally important. So it's one of the reasons why I've spent some of my own money to be here, because it is important to have that voice there that can actually have a free conversation without that. And there's plenty of gigs, there's plenty of lobbying power, there's plenty of other things where industry, either irrigators, miners, or farmers, can all have their say in the public process. So I think it's fantastic to have a community set forum. Simple.
Thank you, Gavin. And Bruce. Okay, I'll do a bit of work.
Bruce Honeywell. This is taking on what a little bit for what Gavin just brought up, and it's been discussed today about the necessity of cross-border, particularly what you said, Richard, taking a national approach or even wider. And I've got a two-part question. The first is, late 90s we saw a Lake Eyre Basin coordinating group which was cross-border, which was 95% community-driven. And it brought around a lot of changes in people's attitudes and everything from South Australia, from the Northern Territory, from Queensland, and even New South Wales one or two. We've seen that broken down. Well, under the Howard government, we saw it come, and with regionalisation, there just wasn't in NRM, but it was particularly in NRM. All of a sudden we had DCQ here and all the other groups around Australia. The fences went up, tribalism returned. And now we've seen, from that coming on, now we've got this rap, which the way I see it is just a minister sort of separating himself from the hot potato of pre-election promises to get rid of wild rivers on one hand and incumbent legislation on the other. We've got the rap, and I agree with the comments here. I think it's been watered down. The community representation over 15 years has continually been watered down. The question is, A, are we in danger of losing community representation? And B, what can we take from this meeting, all the people, the energy in this room over these 3 days? Well, how can we take that to somehow start that journey back to get a national approach, cross-border approach, which ties into what Gavin was just saying. So 1 and 2.
Would somebody like to comment on that from the panel? And just before, while Alan's coming around, we started at about 10 to, we were a bit late. I'm going to make a suggestion that we keep going for another 15 minutes and then knock off. Is that okay with everyone, or is that inconvenient for you all? Hands up if you think that's a terrible idea. Okay. But democratic, so we'll go for another 15. Thanks very much.
Richard, look, it's a great question. I've been involved in the sort of process, all over that period. And the most interesting thing to me was that when there was a Cooper Creek Catchment Committee and a Georgina Diamantina Catchment Committee, the state border started to dissolve. The state reps on that committee started to think on a catchment scale. The money was coming through those committees. Therefore, the power base had actually been dissolved. And I thought, this is wonderful. We're actually getting community starting to think in a catchment scale, and we're actually dealing with some of these issues that are very important, and we don't have the tribalism of the states occurring. I think the death knell of that was the regional bodies created and stopping at the border, and essentially there was a lot of rhetoric about, yes, we'll keep talking to South Australia from DCQ and Salbo, and that does go on, but in reality, the money flow determines what sort of works get done and where the priorities go. I think in terms of the way forward, I actually really like the things that Polling Tan was talking about. I would really like to think that we could think about co-governance with the community and with government. The cynical part of me says that states won't like that. They won't like relinquishing power. There are issues around the constitution and having power over land and water that will make it a really tough road. But that's not to say we shouldn't actually be doing that sort of thing. Perhaps we should be sending a message, a positive message, that let's take this as an opportunity to say, this is a flashpoint of a fairly local issue, if you like, in Queensland, small-scale irrigation. Let's try and reinforce the importance of managing at a whole catchment scale and strengthening up, if you like, the resolve, the ability of that intergovernment agreement to actually engage and do what it's supposed to do and look after the place.
Thank you, Richard. Would anybody else on the panel like to have a quick shot at that one, or shall we move on?
Just one comment. This is an opportunity, Leonie Nunn, an opportunity for the Lake Eyre Basin Community Advisory Committee and the scientific panel to maybe get a bit more grunt going. And
you mean the sap and the cack?
Yeah. And I'm not casting aspersions or anything like that, and I'm a member of one of those committees, so I think this is something we should be focusing on as a group, the Lake Eyre Basin Community Advisory Committee and the scientific panel, and really trying to make the agreement have some teeth, because it's something that's in place already.
The only known one's grunt and teeth. And so, on that note, Tom Crothers, I'd like you to ask a question.
Tom Crothers, picking up on Janet's comments about... Oh, sorry. Try not to hit me? Good, thanks. Picking up on Janet's comments about needing to have a solution and when we go to talk to the Queensland Government, the question I have is, has the RAP formed a position on what the irrigation sector and what the resources sector should look like in this basin? Have they got a shape, a view in their shape, a view of what shape each of those particular matters should be? Because my understanding is that you need to provide some advice to the minister probably within the next 4 weeks.
I'm sure none of the other panel wants to answer that.
What are the terms of reference of the RAP?
Look, as a member of the RAP, I still think we have a lot of discussion. It's not clear exactly what our job is, except that our job is to deliver a different mechanism for protecting the rivers and taking account of small-scale irrigation. I think, and there are two other RAP members here, and they may or may not want to comment, but I think the big challenge for me is to get clear exactly what the minister wants, and I'm not clear that that's the case, but I would imagine the path we're treading currently is well, I mean, we may reach a consensus, but there are some obvious differences of opinion, particularly about the levels of protection and what they mean. And so, you know, we're challenged in terms of that. But we haven't had that discussion about what's the output going to look like. And, you know, that certainly I will be pushing for that when we have our next meeting is what will the report to the minister actually look like, and which areas do we have an identity and which areas do we have a committee type of identity. So at this stage I think it's still a bit grey.
Is that a comment or a question, Dave?
Just a question. What do you think the minister meant when he said you've got to accommodate small-scale irrigation? What does he mean by small-scale?
Well, all I can recount is the meeting, which was I couldn't make the meeting, but Angus and I think maybe Trevor were. That we were essentially asked to. We did ask the minister what small scale meant and whether lots of small scales made a large scale, and we didn't really get a clear response on that. So. And those are part of the discussions we're having within the RAP. And there is starting to get more of a sort of idea about what small scale is, and maybe it's around, I think the current small scale irrigation that's happening is about 1,600 megalitres, that sort of a licence.
In one or in several?
Good question. So these are all decisions that we're not clear about. We're not clear, for example, about. I think we do seem to that there is some discussion about, you know, the current water resource plan and the amount of water that's on the table, and there is certainly a view being articulated that we don't want any more water to come along and be opened up. So within that envelope, what would small scale irrigation look like? And I guess my concern is this is only a 10-year plan, and if we have an envelope currently for the next 10 years, there's nothing to stop us having a new envelope in another 10 years.
Small scale irrigation is going to be a big question. Howard Hobbs, we'll go to back.
Thanks, Howard Hobbs, member for Warrego. I guess that probably need to make a couple of quick comments and then to the question. First of all, I want to congratulate everybody for their enthusiasm and their absolute interest in what they're doing and being here today, because it is very, very important that we get together to pull together the ideas. Wild rivers. The system of wild rivers has generally basically been a fairly dodgy process overall. That's from our point of view. Your model here was probably one of the better models that were around. A lot of work had been put into it, and it was vastly improved. And probably had there been other wild rivers modelled like yours, we wouldn't be here today. The reality is that sciences can be varied to the situation. As you all know, many of you are scientists here today. I was also Minister of Natural Resources and saw amazing science. And I'll give you an example of one of the examples that I saw. I was Minister. We did the modelling of Lake Eyre. Of this catchment, the Cooper catchment. And I saw the water was there. We didn't know what, basically, you know, it was all early days, and we're working our way through things. And then I happened to see the same model, or similar model, after we were out of government. And a lot of the water had gone. I said to the public servant, what happened to the water? Oh, the minister didn't want it to be there. You know, this is the sort of thing that happens. At the end of the day, we're going to make sure what we do is correct. We've got to make sure that it's fair. People know. I'll give you one more quick example. I'm sorry to take a bit of time, but Ed mentioned this afternoon on Skype there, talking about Professor Peter Cullen. The Condamine Ballona is probably the only true figures we have for a water management plan in Queensland that's been scientifically driven right down to the raw data. We had a hell of a fight down there because the science was wrong on the WAMP. It was proven in the court that was wrong. The government were using at the time any information that was part of their case was used. Anything detrimental to their case wasn't used. Was found in the court that was wrong. So Professor Cullen goes in there and his group of the Wentworth group, and he was head of the Wentworth group, and they did the analysis based on raw data, not from a point in time. And so we ended up with a system that hopefully, you know, was right. So I think that the role here today is we've got to progress this along further. You've had a very valuable input meeting. You need to have more stakeholder involvement. The Minister wants to know about small-scale irrigation. Well, so do I. So does everybody. I mean, I don't think I'd be totally opposed to, along with Vaughan and Bruce Scott, any large-scale irrigation in these areas. The system is just not suitable for it. Small scale, if it's very, very, very small, it's happening now. You have those small irrigation areas operating now in this catchment. And you don't want a lot more, that's for sure. But I mean, you need to come up with the answers. The government, I don't believe, have any predetermined outcome for this. You've got to tell us what you want. It's not just, you know, the scientists. We want the locals. We want the people for the region. I mean, a true representative input as to what you need. I mean, like Noosa. Noosa have got themselves a fantastic niche in the world market for tourism because they market themselves as green and everything else up there, and it's a wonderful little area. This is the same, and you can keep it that way. And I ask the question: how bad has the management been in the Lake Eyre catchment before Wild Rivers? Anything go wrong? Not really. And they had no Wild Rivers to protect it. So this day and age, we've got to have more things like, you know, mining can come in and so forth. And I personally wouldn't like to see CSG in here. I've been very, very involved in the CSG industry down in my area down there, and we've made some dramatic changes. We would never have had the CSG industry operate the way it is.
Howard, can you come to your question?
Yeah. So I guess sorry about this. I guess
it's not Parliament.
Yeah, I know. It is a bit hard. But anyway, I guess the point is this: that how soon do you think, as a panel, you can come up with some solutions, as the minister's asked? You know, what is small-scale irrigation, and will there be further consultation with the local communities?
Thank you very much, and we'll have to make that our last question too. But we'll hear all the responses.
Thanks, Howard. I guess Richard.
Part of your answer that how we might get a conservation rep that actually the minister will talk to.
I guess from my understanding, whatever you badged Wild Rivers as being, the motivation behind it was to ensure we had a free-flowing river for the long term. I think calling it Wild Rivers, there's a whole lot of issues around all of that. But the key things are, how do you stop further development, i.e. erosion of flows in the river. And the other one, which it's clear that the water resource legislation is still not very good at controlling overland flows. And so it is a big loophole currently, both for control access to overland flows by would-be infrastructure and the potential to impact on overland flows with developments, whatever they be, from road up to mine. To me, those are the two critical issues we have to get right here. I do have a concern, which I've already articulated, and which is that everywhere in the world, small-scale irrigation ramps up to large-scale irrigation. Ed Fessy said that today. Connemine-Ballon, small-scale graziers, I think Po Ling Tan talked about that. That's where it started. And the way it does that is not so much, it's actually, you would know how it's a political process in the sense that there's an issue about how small scale, are we actually able to make enough money out of small scale in a variable river? No, we're not. We need more water. The Cooper Creek Irrigators Council forms. They are able to then lobby government and say, look, the water resource plan's coming up for review in 10 years' time. We need more water on the table. And this is we're a major economic group in the community. We're bringing in a lot of export dollars. You should listen to us. And it's bracket creep. Over time, you can lose a river. And it's happened. It's happened in Australia. It's happened everywhere else in the world. And I think there is a different path, which is, yes, there is irrigation in the catchment. My belief is that we should...
we just keep that context, because 250 hectares total in Georgina Diamantina,
Yep.
62 hectares in the Cooper.
So,
That's the existing
so there's not a lot of irrigation.
No.
250 hectares in the Georgina and, what was it, 60 hectares?
62 hectares in the Cooper.
In the Cooper. So we're not talking about a lot of irrigation currently. So I guess my concern is about what the thin end of the wedge might mean because of all of those things that we've talked about. In terms of solutions, look, I think, and you know, this forum, not in Parliament. So this forum is about trying to get more of a community input into this process and a national one. I think there's an opportunity to have more of a national approach, intergovernment approach to this. Sorry.
Getting back to Howard's, the pointy end of his question, which was, you know, at what point do you think we can this group or can some part of it influence this decision, and how, and what do you think, Janet? And this is your last comment, so go for it, mate. Remember, for South Australia.
I've been talking to Trevor Naismith, and he's been talking to me about putting all the comments, summarising all the points that have been taken from the last couple of days and tomorrow morning, and we'll take them back to our board as well as the state government department, DUNA, and hopefully feed that up to our minister, who is part of that ministerial agreement, the whatever you call it. I mean, there's a CAC meeting, LEB Community Advisory Committee meeting.
A CAC?
A CAC meeting. That's in 2 weeks' time. Like, really, that agenda should probably just be focused on this and nothing else. Richard said that tomorrow there's an item on the agenda that's called the communique. That is there to precipitate everything out of this last couple of days, so there'll be that. I'm not too sure what to do beyond that in the short term.
Keep working.
What do you think, Scott?
I'm glad you fellas went before I did, because I've been sitting here trying to calm myself down. Mr. Hobbs talked about Wild Rivers being a little bit dodgy. I'm here thinking about his party's approach to conservation and looking after this country, and I think that's a bit bloody dodgy. The previous process that I've been through as a member on this Wild Rivers thing that you think's a bit dodgy, were pretty bloody solid from my point of view. We talked to, I remember talking to a whole heap of Aboriginal people, and I'm sure all the local community mob here, through Bob and all these people, been talking to a whole lot of graziers, through David Brooks and all them fellas, through Angus. This stuff's already been done, mate, and you fellas come along trying to do it again because you want a different outcome. Let's be honest. You want a different outcome. You want small-scale irrigation here, and you want other stuff happening on this country. So don't go trying to hide from the facts here. The process that we went through was pretty solid. So don't go knocking that process. It mightn't be a real flash up in the Cape. This is not the bloody Cape. This is this country here. There's different rivers. So, and different people. And we speak for us, not Noel Pearson. So don't go trying to tell that fella up there what happens down here. The other thing I want to say is, yeah. The other thing I want to say too, Mr. Newman said that he was going to listen to Aboriginal people. He only listened to one Aboriginal person at this moment. He hadn't had the opportunity, and he hadn't given me the opportunity to talk to him. So if through your connections you can give me that yarn to him, I'll tell him what blackfellas think about out here. All right? So there's a challenge for you.
Thank you, Scott Gorringe. I'm going to give the last word to Leonie Nunn.
Thanks.
Because you've got such a bubbly personality, hasn't it?
Okay, I don't know what to say after all that. Now, I think we have got a great opportunity here to get the communique right tomorrow, to go to the government, this government, and to the South Australian government, and to the federal government, and to the Northern Territory government. I think Angus, as chair of CAC, should be going back and saying this needs to be discussed at our CAC meeting. That's all I can say. Because I don't know much about this panel. I'm not on that panel.
Sorry, Janet. You know what?
Now, can I ask a quick question?
Well, we don't have time to answer a quick question. So no. Okay, ask you a quick question.
No, it was for Howard up there. Have you got a timeline when you think all these comments should be in and up on the table by?
Sorry, no, I don't, and I haven't been talking to Andrew just lately about it, but happy to sort of to come back. But I think there is.
10 seconds.
It's got to be pretty, reasonably quick.
25th of the next month.
Yeah, fairly quick. Yeah.
Something like that.
No, it's already been
Thanks very much for that. And I think that we should declare that the inaugural, what are we going to call it? The Spotlight on Lake Eyre Basin Q&A trial, medium-sized country town forum thing is some kind of at least a minor success. We can only build on it in future. I'd like you to put your hands together for the panel. I'd also like you to put your hands together for Alan Hoggett, who has worked his butt off. And yes, his job has been one of the hardest ones here. And on your way out, if you could please take your cutlery and accoutrements out to that room there, or just here apparently, but take them out of this room, put them on the table, and we shall tidy them up for you. Thank you very much. Thank you for hanging around, and thank you for participating in the wonderful.
I think we should give the facilitator a round of applause too.